Everybody's out.
We are live. All right. This is Family Law. It's February 7th, I believe. Feels like it. I just wanted to, I think everybody should got an email about the Legal Studies Society. Did everybody get an email about that? Is that tomorrow? Tomorrow at 3:30 in this room, maybe? Or 13:30, which I think is next to this one. That one. I think it's next to this room. Anyway, yeah. Somebody asked me actually if we can do the same thing where we stream it and everything and record it, so I'll do that too. Because not everybody can come, but I'll try to remember to email that out and say that I'm going to do that. So if you want to come, so if anybody can't make it, they could come live like this where we have folks on. Okay, if you really wanted to do that. Otherwise, I don't know if we're going to have that kind of structure to the class, but just wanted to point that out, or not the class, to the meeting. I'm not really going to run it, but I'll set this part up so anyway, come, that'd be fun. All right, I think it's a good opportunity. All right, so by the way, if you haven't already finished it, the quiz for chapters 1 through 4 is due by midnight tonight. If you already finished it, then I'm not going to grade a test till I have them all. That's just how I work. I just don't do it early like that. It sounds good and everything. So I probably won't touch it till tomorrow at the earliest. All right, I'm sure you'll be fine.
Yeah.
All right, so moving on, any questions about subsequent material? I mean, we're not going to go over the quiz in case anybody hasn't taken it yet or anything, but any other questions about things that we've talked about before? None? Okay, good. So we're moving then into the next area, which to me, this is the simplest thing that happens in family law. This is the simplest thing, and it's divorce. Divorce is the easiest part of family law. Really, it is. Legally, I'm not saying every way, but legally, this is the easiest thing that you're going to do in family law. Okay? That's pretty easy. It's really easy. Why do I say it's easy?
Is it like the most legally outlined?
Okay, yeah, it's pretty straightforward. How do you get divorced, right? So how do you get divorced? Well, there's another way to think of divorce, and it's the word they use is dissolve. How do you dissolve a marriage? Okay, a lot of times we just think of that as divorce, but really, you dissolve a marriage when one of those people dies. It makes sense, right? We even have a new term for you after your spouse dies, right? Yes? What's your term? What's the term for you? You're a widow, unless you're a male, and then what are you? You're a widower. So you can be widowed and widowered. Did you know that? Widowed and widowered. Burgled. It's like being burgled. That's right. Okay. So anyway, you get the idea. You can also have an annulment, which really, in some cases, is saying, in some cases that you can have them like they're always void. So is it really a marriage that's dissolved? Okay. But divorce is the easiest one, and that's because that's termination by a court. Okay. So the whole structure for divorce is set out, but it's really the easy part. Anybody have any other comments? It's legally laid out. How do you get a divorce, right? What do we think of as being part of divorce? What is a divorce? Like, what happens in court? What are we talking about?
Separation of two people and their property.
Okay, so we're separating them and their property. Okay, is that divorce?
Part of it.
It's part of it. It's part of the proceeding, right? What else about divorce? What else is usually included in what we think of as divorce? It's maybe children.
It's a big part of it. Alimony.
Support, okay, child support or spouse support.
Custody is a big deal when the kids are down there.
Yeah, custody is big, really big. Okay, but let's do something and forget about those other pieces that are the really complicated part. That's the hard part of divorce. The easy part is what?
Filing the papers.
Filing the papers. That's easy. Maybe. That's pretty easy, right? Yeah, it's not like you don't have to invent it, right? So you file them, all right? Then what happens?
Yeah, they hearing or mediation.
You don't want to hear. You want what happens after you.
Mediation.
No, something else going to happen on the other side. Anytime you start a case, you start it. One person starts it, and the other person does what? Answers it, right? So you answer it. Okay, now you're pretty much nothing else needs to be decided usually, right? In a divorce, nothing else needs to be decided about whether or not you're going to dissolve your marriage, right? I file a petition for divorce, you file an answer. It's over. The divorce part's over. You're divorced, right?
No.
Usually, pretty much, right? That's all you got to do, and you're divorced now. That's great, isn't it? Your marriage is over. That's not great. Your marriage is over. You're no longer married. It's done. Now what?
Celebrate.
Could be great. Smoke a cigar. I don't know what.
Get remarried.
It depends.
That's mine.
But that part's easy. Okay? Because why? Why is the divorce, the ending of the marriage, easy legally? Divorce party, yeah. It's kind of like a reception after the wedding, right? Have a cake for the divorce party?
I had a cake.
Well, that's good. Well, come on. Why is it easy? Why is it easy to become divorced? Legally.
Because we have laws that help us do that.
Okay, but what about it? Why are you usually getting divorced?
You want a little bit?
I don't need details. Why are we generally getting divorced? Generally,
We don't like the other person.
we have differences,
Yes.
right? We don't like the other person. Irreconcilable differences, right? We have some different. Okay, so we have no fault, right? Sometimes we have no fault. Can we have fault? Yes, we can. Okay, so what you have to think of is that divorce is easy. But that's just the start, okay? Because of what we now know and what we have in this day and age is no fault divorce. So we pretty much agree with each other. At some point, we're just going to get divorced. I don't like you. You don't like me. I don't want to live with you anymore. I'm out. Right? That part about being unmarried is easy. Okay, so look at this. In 3 eras of divorce, and I just only point this out to say that you all know, we've talked about this historically. Why do we do a lot of the things we do in divorce? It's because of history, right? Why is family court the way it is? Why is family law the way it is? Because of the history of it. And really, marriage has what? History. Conservative, religious history, right? It has those kind of laws, what they call the canon laws, before it has the statutory laws, the governmental law. So we have to think of it. But as we go through, we have the 3 eras of divorce, and we used to have what are called restrictive era. And the restrictive era meant that you were only able to be divorced if there was someone at fault for the divorce. What do you think the most common fault ground was? Adultery, right? It was just the first one. It was the main one. That pretty much, even then, still restrictive. You could only get it in certain cases. Even today, adultery is not really a fault ground if after the knowledge of the adultery occurs, and then you re-accept the person as your spouse. Then that goes away as a fault ground even. Okay? Which was particularly true in the restrictive era. So if you were willing to accept it, you move back in, everything, you're going to go back the way it was, more or less. You couldn't get, that wasn't even a fault ground. So what do you think happened? So you couldn't really get divorced from anyone, right? It was probably pretty hard. Unity of person, for one thing. How do you divorce yourself, right?
Did the divorce laws heavily favor men over women back in
Of course.
the day?
Of course, except when it came, even historically, except when it came to custody, child custody. But of course, yeah, property level. But actually, a lot of it was built in to protect the wife, now the ex-wife. So because of the history that there weren't a lot of two-worker households and things like that. Okay, so what do you think happened during the restrictive as we get closer to this next one, which is the collusive era? But the restrictive era of divorce was basically you had to have a good reason, a very good reason. Even then, most churches didn't really accept those reasons, right? There's always a chance. But what happens to that? People still wanted to get divorced, right? So what did they do? What did most people do? They moved into separate bedrooms, separate wings of the house, out of the house. They were still married though, right? They didn't legally become unmarried. They just were not married, practically, right? But they decided they still want to be divorced, so what they came up with was what? What do you think the collusive means?
Just a mutual agreement?
They would create a fault ground, like domestic violence was a common one. That was a fault ground. So they would stage it, right? You would allege, yep, there was abuse, so we could get fault, so we could become divorced. We were faking it, right? Maybe not always faking it, but sometimes. So collusive meant basically that people were like coming up with fault grounds. They were faking it. They were faking the fault. So was that a good result? No, it wasn't. So then we came up with, generally speaking, the fault grounds or the no fault grounds for divorce, which are the key things. What a no fault? Basically, that's what we know. We know that's how divorce works now. Irreconcilable differences. There's different ones that we can look at, and we'll talk about those in a minute. But basically, there's no more fault. I don't want to live with you. You don't want to live with me. We're done. Okay? We're done. We're divorced now. So what's the problem with that? Is there any downside to that? Sounds pretty good. It's better than lying about it, right? We go into court and perjure ourselves to make sure we can get divorced. It's better than that, right? By the way, in West Virginia, that was still going on into the 80s. Collusive divorce was still going on in West Virginia until the end of the 80s. People were perjuring themselves in court. They would come in and lie about it. Right? Was that a big deal? Probably not. It's a white lie.
It was the 80s.
We got the result. It was the 80s. I don't know. I wasn't there. But the point is, there's no fault. We came up with that as a legal system because we just were following what was really happening. So what is the downside to no fault divorce, though? Think about history. And again, why do a lot of the laws, we talked about that, some of it benefited the males, but there was a lot of protection for the wives, right?
But no fault's not really a reason.
It's not a reason.
It's not exactly, when you go through your divorce proceedings, you actually have to file under something.
No, you don't. You can pick that one irreconcilable difference. Yeah, you can pick that.
But you have to have something. I don't think that a no fault.
What's wrong with no fault? It's the easy part. You come in, I agree, we don't want to live, we don't want to be married, we're done, we move on to the hard part. I call it, we start, and then that's when the fight starts. We get divorced, then the fight starts.
But with a no fault, don't you have to live separately for a certain amount of period
No.
of time?
That might be one of them. No, you don't.
The only thing I could think of is probably the lack of precedence. Might make some issues more murky when it comes to no fault.
Okay, so we don't have, one of the negatives might be that we don't have enough legal it hasn't been explored legally enough to have good resolutions to follow when it comes to that.
Yeah, and I guess too, like, a downside potentially would be, like with fault-based divorce, usually the person who was at fault, they were punitive, you know, the person who wasn't at fault got more in the divorce.
The person who wasn't at fault,
Yeah, they would be granted
they would get
more
more.
of what they wanted.
Okay, so
And so
in
I
a,
guess,
go ahead.
you know, you could see that as a downside if you want more, if you're divorced, but it's a no-fault divorce.
Okay, so in a no-fault divorce, you don't, one side, the faulted person, doesn't get as much a benefit
Yeah,
from the other one being faulty.
yeah, I guess. So,
I don't know how to make fault a different word there, anyway.
right?
Okay, so in the old days, if someone was really badly at fault, they're gonna lose in this case, right? The person who doesn't want to be divorced, sometimes that was what happens. Still happens all the time. One person is totally shocked by this happening, right? Sometimes. They don't know about it. They find out about it. They didn't want their marriage to end, but because this other person was a lot at fault, they wanted out. Now they do want out. I mean, I'm not saying they don't at any point, but they do. They want out now. Should there be some reward to the person who's not at fault? Can't the faulting person, okay, the one that's now set up a new house with another person, and they're going to get the benefit, they're going to walk over into this other house and leave the other person destitute, basically? We're going to split it in half, right? Isn't there that's a downside, isn't it?
We don't have the facts that that person could have been a shady person.
We're not thinking about particular people, right? But what we're saying is, in essence, that now fault doesn't play in as much. Now, if the one person has committed adultery, there's no downside to it, to that person. It's just still even, right? Any other downsides? Don't sometimes people go to court and they want their day in court? I want to blame the other person. I'm hurt, right? Isn't there a counseling aspect to the divorce process? Sometimes you want to tell somebody else like all the horrible things, right? Yeah, we got that, but that's not as fun as court, is it? It can be, yes. But not as good as that like public forum type thing, right?
They don't let you talk. They don't.
Why no? Nobody cares about that, but there's somebody's going to listen to you.
Nobody listens to you. They just sit there and ask you a bunch of questions. Then they ask the other person a bunch of questions. You can't really say what you really are thinking or feeling.
Why no? That's the other downside. But isn't that a downside? In a fault case, one of the things that happens in all the rest of, so the first thing that happens is you get a divorce, and then the fight starts, okay? And the fight starts about the property, the house, the cars, the kids, right? That's where all the things, but you got this other part, like, we wouldn't have been divorced if that person wasn't no good about these, right? But that's not relevant to how that person hurt you. Has nothing really to do with custody, or might, I suppose. There are times it might. Does it really have anything to do with whether or not you should split the stuff evenly? Not really, right? Does it really have much to do with those things? Do you really, so is it relevant to when you want to say how terrible the person is? Is that relevant to these property distribution? Not usually, right? So you don't get your day in court with that, right? Isn't that a negative? So it leaves things unresolved? I don't know, maybe not. I'm guessing the judge doesn't want to know more, right? I mean, any other things you can see as a downside to no-fault divorce?
Other than a time lashing from your judge saying people are stupid.
Okay, that's a downside. I don't know. I can't. I'm not tying
They
that.
go on their rants about you make up your mind and.
Okay. I don't know what that's a downside to whether or not that'd be different in a fault versus no fault. Moving on. Any other downsides? I don't know. Maybe there are. Okay, so the next question then is fault irrelevant in no fault divorces then?
I think on a legal level, it would be. I think the only place the fault would count would be between the two parties in their own relationship. But as far as legal proceedings go, you can't be like, well, he never thanked me when I made dinner,
Okay.
and then that somehow weigh in on, you know, the decisions being made.
Okay. So you know, not really on a legal sense is it relevant. Those things aren't relevant to whether or not you get half the house or half the properties, you know, or whatever, however it works out, right? Is it really is it relevant to child support? Is it relevant to child custody?
That would be the only place I could think of it being sort of relevant. Because of you're taking into consideration all the things that will affect the child's upbringing.
Mm-hmm.
And
So you could factor it in about how good the person is. Is it relevant to whether or not they get custody time?
Yeah, I would say.
Okay, so you could play it in there. Have anything to do with child support?
I think that would rely more on who gets custody and their financial situation.
Okay. So if somebody's causing a divorce, more or less, then makes financial things different for the child. It's not the child's fault. Okay. So those are points that there obviously are some downsides to having no fault divorce. Okay, just throwing those out. Think about that. It sounds good because it's easy, right? We just agree. So what are the no fault grounds? The first one is living apart, and I put up living apart means generally we live separate and apart. In Ohio, that means separated and apart for 1 year without cohabitation. Okay, that means in Ohio differently than West Virginia. So look at West Virginia's. It says separate and apart in separate abodes without cohabitation or interruption for 1 year. Okay? The difference here is that in Ohio, you literally have to live with each other another night. In West Virginia, you don't have to have it be an overnight. And it can interrupt that 1 year period. Okay? Does that make sense?
Like a year and a day?
No, like sometime in that year that you're no longer living in the same house, something occurs but doesn't take overnight. Something you might do in a marriage
Right, okay. That's where you're going with that.
that breaks up the 1 year. Seriously. In West Virginia.
Can you just say it and spell it out for us? I can't take
It's
it.
too many letters. I'm thinking to another Big Bang Theory reference. Okay. So that's the first one. That one seems relatively obvious. I mean, that's a no-fault ground. We don't live together for a year. We probably are like to a level where we don't need to agree that we should get divorced. I mean, it's like, well, we're not really living married, okay? So the next one is incompatibility. In Ohio, we have that. Incompatibility means irreconcilable differences, or we're not compatibles. We can't live together, okay? We have different sleep patterns. I don't know. But incompatibility is I can allege it and say, we're not compatible, and as long as you agree, we're done, okay? That's the key to no-fault divorce. I allege that we live separate and apart for a year. You agree, you know, your answer says, that's true, we're divorced, okay? The court doesn't have anything else to take up. Incompatibility is another one of those. West Virginia doesn't have that in the statute. Irreconcilable differences is really the most common, okay? Sometimes they refer to that as in disillusion, which is a separate area in Ohio, but that's what you might look at, irreconcilable differences. Sounds a little bit like we're agreeing we're gonna get divorced, okay? That's what irreconcilable. West Virginia has that specific terminology in West Virginia, so in the statute. So those are the main no-fault grounds. The whole key to these are that you agree. So one person alleges it in the divorce petition, and the other one answers that that's true. Okay? I'll tell you this. Then the next thing that happens is, in fault grounds, those are where you're alleging that there's a reason we should be divorced, and it's because that the other person did something wrong. The most common being adultery. I put the statutes for you. This one's really falling out, as really is there much to it? But I'll tell you, in West Virginia, adultery is still a crime in the books. It still will get you removed from being mayor or really any city or county government job in West Virginia. Isn't that weird? So if you commit adultery, you can be kicked out of your job, your public office for that. I don't know about that. That wasn't proven in court. But the adultery can be grounds, right? So you get the point. But anyway, adultery is was traditionally the most common, except that, so what we do when we file a divorce petition is we allege a no-fault ground. Usually it's this one, irreconcilable differences. We may do the separate and apart for a year, but you don't have to do that. You'll allege this, and then you'll also allege one of the fault grounds. One being adultery, the other one being cruelty, and I've showed up there. Ohio has extreme cruelty, West Virginia has cruel or inhuman treatment, basically the same thing. Desertion is where, in Ohio, it means willful absence from the other party for 1 year, so that's where you disappear, kind of, okay? West Virginia willfully abandons or deserts for 6 months. That's even quicker, right? So you can, it's where you just move out and you don't really make contact anymore. That's a fault ground, as opposed to living separate and apart, which is more agreeable. Like, we've decided we're not going to live together. Okay, then there are some other grounds you can put together. Okay, in Ohio, one of them is a husband or wife living at the time of marriage. What's that mean? It's really an annulment in that sense. You're married, you can't be bigamous, so you were married before, that can be a ground for divorce. It's a fraudulent contract, any gross neglect of duty, habitual drunkenness, imprisonment, and you give them a divorce outside the state. Okay, West Virginia says if you're convicted of a felony, you can get divorced if someone's convicted of a felony, right? You don't have to be married to a felon if you don't want to. Permanent and incurable insanity, habitual drunkenness, that always comes back, or drug addiction, abuse or neglect of a child. So that becomes an extra ground that we didn't see before, okay? So what you do when you file a divorce petition is you allege a no-fault ground. And you allege, usually, another fault ground. Why would you do that? So you do one of the no faults, and you also allege a fault ground. Why would you do that?
In case one of them is rejected by court.
Okay, so you're allowed to, in court, in civil procedure, in any state, you can do what we know as alternative pleading. You can plead things that look like they don't relate to each other, that are inconsistent. So if I do the no fault, what am I looking for? The agreement of the other side that that's true. And in the fault, if they don't agree, I still got this other one. So it doesn't make the case fail. Okay, so give you an example. If in Ohio I raised that we've lived separate and apart for a year, and you can test that, if I had also alleged desertion, I can win without your agreement, right? Okay. So you get those ideas. Why I put that out there is to say that you always allege both, basically, unless you already know ahead of time that you're going to agree and there's really not much there. Usually put something. Commonly, it's the cruel and inhuman treatment.
That one's hard to get to scratch.
It doesn't. It almost never sticks because no one wants to have a trial on whether or not you cruelly treated your spouse, right? So that's what you'll have. In no-fault divorce, or I'm sorry, in fault divorce, you're going to have a whole hearing. All the evidence of all the terrible things you've done are going to come out. Every skeleton you didn't know existed and that you didn't know someone could remember comes out, okay? In a fault case. So people don't like fault cases very much, right? That's one of the benefits as opposed to one of the weaknesses or things you don't like about them, okay? So just want to lay those out. I'm giving you the statutory sites so that you can look at them a little bit if you wanted to. But basically, we know for the most part, the fault grounds really aren't in play, are hardly ever. Usually by the time you filed a divorce petition, the people are either, you reconcile on your own so you don't need the case to go forward, or you've agreed that you do want to be divorced, okay? That's usually not, again, what you're going to fight about, right? You're not going to fight about whether or not we want to be divorced. I may not want to do it because I don't want to move out. I don't want to deal with, I don't want to pay spousal support. I don't want to pay child support. I may not want a divorce for those reasons, but those are really a separate set of arguments, set of things that you have to determine. So I say all that to say, why again did I say divorce is the easy part? It's basically just paperwork. We agree. What do we not usually agree about? Our stuff and our kids and our money. It's part of stuff. We usually don't agree about those things. So that's where the fight is. That's not in this chapter. We don't talk about that in this chapter. Okay? So any questions about those issues?
How hard is it to make the ground stick a permanent insanity?
Permanent insanity would be, because you can be adjudged insane by a court. We have hygiene commissioners that can do that.
Really? I just-
Probably that would be the easiest way to prove that.
You can't just accuse somebody of
Right.
insanity without a
Right.
cause.
You have to get the judge to accept that you're
Right,
going
that's
to.
what I'm saying.
It would be hard if the person isn't already in mental health treatment or something. You know people probably that are what they call adjudged insane, which means that they're determined that they can't make legal decisions for
Right.
themselves. They have a guardian or conservator. They don't have any legal capacity, which makes sense. You should be able to divorce that person for that reason, right? Doesn't mean that everyone does. I'm not saying just because any of those things occur, people are automatically like, you're no longer married. You still got to file.
What about cases like, say, if the other party becomes incapacitated through an accident or and they're in a coma? I mean, what do you do with that?
I don't see that one on there.
No, but I'm just asking, I mean,
Are there
if you want to
grounds
divorce
for it?
that person because they're, incapacitated and they have to have medical care and life support for like 20 years. and
Right,
so-
exactly.
Are they conscious or not conscious? Unconscious. Okay. In that case, I don't think you can divorce them while they're living.
Really?
Really?
Because I know someone who did that.
Well, she was.
Yeah. Well, I'll give you a classic example. A classic example where this was an issue was Terry Shire.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what happened? She was on life support
She
for
had
20
kidney
years.
issues and they wanted to
right?
do all that.
She didn't come out of a coma for that period of time. It became a bigger issue about right to life and things like that had more about whether or not you should have living wills and all that kind of what would she have desired? There's lots of complicated things. That's why you should have a living will and you've told somebody what you would want if that kind of thing ever happens to you, just as another point of legal advice. But in her case, what had happened? That was related to marriage and how you would want to go.
She wasn't in a coma. I mean, she was incapacitated, but she had a feeding tube, right?
She was not conscious, at least not
But
so that
she had
her
work
body was living. I think her eyes were open from time to time, but she could not communicate. She had a stroke as a result, if I remember right, of bulimia or anorexia.
Yeah. It was one of
I don't remember, but that's what happened. Okay. But she was out. She couldn't communicate. All right. Do you remember any more about that situation?
Yeah, they had to go to court and fight.
But what was the dispute? I mean, let's not go about what happened.
To let her live or to let her die. The parents,
And
I think, wanted her.
The parents wanted her to live, hoping for a miracle. And her husband, who now, like 15 years later, he didn't believe that there would be. Okay. Not that he didn't love her. That was an issue that rose at that point. But it was years, more than a decade later, that rose that he just wanted to move on. But he wanted to move on with his life was what his side of the story was. He wanted to be remarried for that matter. So it became a conflict about whether or not he really cared Okay, that's like beyond the legal part of it.
But isn't it just a point of, right to live? I mean,
Well, yeah, that's
but
way
then-
more
but
complicated
he
than the
could not-
divorce
but he
question.
could
But
not
how do you
divorce her.
divorce that person? In that case, you can't.
Really?
You can't because she can't consent to it.
You
Is
can't
it,
do
is it a
no
fault? Is there fault?
or-
No, there's no
No.
fault,
But she's incapacitated.
but that's not one of the grounds.
Oh, I see what you're.
So you can't like come up with it, but you can end a marriage by death, annulment, or divorce, right?
I'm quite sure you could.
Okay, so you see the point. That's an example. I don't think you can.
So you would have to have just another basis for it then, because you could divorce
There is no
someone
precedent.
regardless, right?
There's no
You just
precedent,
couldn't
right?
use that as a grounds. I don't know. I
There's
knew
no
someone, in Maryland who was married to a guy, he had a motorcycle accident and it permanently messed up his brain. And it
But then I
was
bet he had
more
some
than
kind of
there.
permanent, maybe insanity is not the word, but
Disability.
Something.
And
But
probably if you have if somebody is now your guardian,
yes, I would have.
you can actually, I know you can do that because a guardian can represent you in a divorce.
I imagine that's what happened, something like that. She divorced him, but she was with him for like a year or so after the fact. And then before you knew it, she severed all ties.
Right, and I mean, that's what makes, those are more complicated issues.
Right.
But yeah, I think if you do have a guardian, I think somebody can act on your behalf, can represent you. I know an executor can represent you in a divorce case, which is confusing as heck because a lot of times if your divorce isn't final, the executor is a lot of times your spouse. So your spouse is now both sides of the same divorce.
How does that even happen?
It's really hard to figure out because now you're both the petitioner and the respondent in your own divorce.
I don't know.
Hence why they make the divorce decision pretty quickly,
Yeah.
usually. Okay, but there's lots of things that happen at that point once you file a divorce and all that. Okay, so any other questions about these fault versus no fault grounds? Okay, I hope you understand those areas. Legal separation is actually just basically doing everything but formalizing the divorce part. It's actually the other part. It's usually the part you fight about. It's your stuff, it's your money, it's your kids, but you're not divorced. It's like the opposite of what we normally see. Why would someone want to be legally separated?
Religious reasons.
Okay, that's probably most likely one of them.
So they could cohabitate with another person.
No, can you do that?
Yeah, you can.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you're legally separated now, there's not adultery,
Um,
confusingly.
Yeah, that's a bit confusing to me. Because you're still married, even if you're separated, you haven't made that final tie. I don't know.
It's confusing. It's a confusing issue. That can be part of your agreement, but legally separated, you're doing the things like spousal support, child custody, your property distribution. You're living separate and different apart lives. Why would you do it? Religious is one reason.
And if you don't want to, I mean, even financial reasons, couldn't there be financial reasons? for
Yes, because once you're divorced, do you get like retirement benefits or disability benefits from a spouse? No.
pensions?
No.
No.
Health insurance?
No.
Once you're divorced, you don't get those things, right? So those are all factors that play in. Okay. The other, another way of referring to it is in separation in West Virginia, we call it separate maintenance, which basically deals with those other pieces. That's what we call it. In Ohio, this is another point that you sometimes might do it so you can convert it to a divorce later. In Ohio, you have to live in Ohio for 6 months. So you could file a separation case, and then after you meet the 6-month residence requirement, you can convert it to a divorce. So that might be one reason you do it. You'll see that from time to time. A married couple move into the state of Ohio, and then they want to get divorced within the first period of time they live there. Then they might file for separation waiting. So they're formalizing the process and moving on. But those things come up like that. But I don't know. Separations are pretty rare in today's world. I mean, divorce is fairly easy, especially if it doesn't involve children and very much property. It's relatively simple to do the process, particularly in Ohio. even more so than West Virginia, I would say.
Really?
Because you can agree to everything in West Virginia or in Ohio easier. A divorce procedure, one of the things you have to know is where can you get divorced? And I'm going to give you a case to read on that. But it has to do with domicile. What is your domicile? Okay, that's the place you intend to live. Usually we call it the place you are physically present with intent to make it a permanent home. You can even live outside this state. Like if West Virginia is your home, this is where you always intend to live. Even though you physically live somewhere else, it's still your domicile, okay? As long as you have something that's physically present here. Usually that means that you have a property or you have a place you could live. That's like folks that really are West Virginians, but in this time of year, they're in Florida, right? And they pass while they're in Florida. They're really West Virginia. They're domiciled in West Virginia because this is where they intended to return. Marissa asks, is there a time limit on how long you can be legally separated? Actually, no. You can be legally separated from now until the end of your life, as long as you continue to agree that that's all right. So there's no time limit on it. A lot of times at some point people will push forward to divorce. It happens to be longer ago. I don't think it's this big of a thing today because, again, with its religious background, that's a lot of times why you would be separated formally, court-ordered separation. So there's no real time to it.
The gentleman I knew he didn't believe, no matter what, he did not believe in divorce. He was legally separated from his wife for almost 45, 50 years.
Sure. And that's just, I think you see less and less of that today. But domicile plays an important part. So let's say you live in Wood County and you're going to get divorced, so you move out. One of you moves out, and you move across the river to Ohio. And you live there because they got a better, singles apartment building or something, I don't know why you do it, but that's a good enough reason to me. You go move. I always think there's a Simpson episode where I think Ned Flanders moves out, and I think it was him. He moves and lives. Is it not him? The principal. Oh, Milhouse is dead. That's right. Moves to the bachelor apartment building. I just remember that episode.
Oh my God.
Anyway, that's why it makes me think it. So you do that. You move over there. Where can you get divorced now?
Isn't it the last place you live together?
Maybe. I think that one's more clear that you could do that. But the question is, the person who moves to Ohio, can they get divorced in the state of Ohio? Yeah, as long as they meet the residency requirements. So we separate because we just weren't getting along, but we maybe had in our mind we might reconcile. Okay? Time apart's good, right? What does that distance make the heart go fonder or something like that? All right, so you move over there, and now you live there for 6 months. So let's assume you meet the requirements to file divorce in another state. So can you go to Ohio? Realizing your marriage was in West Virginia, can you get divorced in Ohio?
They don't have jurisdiction.
How do you know?
Because if the marriage itself took place in West Virginia, how can you, even though you've moved and changed?
Well, people get married. You can go, as a West Virginia resident, you can go to Vegas and get married. Today, Aunt and Mar get divorced, too. That's good. Usually you raise one of the places you can get divorced is the place you got married. So let's say you got married in Vegas, you come back home to West Virginia, and you want it now, when you separate, you go living in Vegas, right? You're going to cash out your 401k and you're going to play poker for a living, right? It's happened, no doubt, right? So now I'm in Vegas. Can I get divorced in Vegas?
No,
My spouse is still back in West Virginia.
no,
Can you?
no.
You can file in another state.
You can file in another state. You can.
You can go find what is it, Costa Rica or Barbados and get a quickie divorce.
Okay, sounds good. That's a good way. Who doesn't want to go to the Caribbean, right? The point being, can you go to another state and file for divorce? Yes. But remember, divorce is easy, right? Just the divorce part can be done. Anywhere you are, basically, you can get divorced. Anywhere you are. Because what we're looking at is what is the domicile of the marriage. It's anywhere either of the spouses are domiciled. So any court has jurisdiction over that. The marriage. What's the other part though? We have the fight still.
Unless you don't want to fight, then you can sign an affidavit.
We can agree to it, right?
What about where the property in question is located, the property in dispute?
So let's go back to our example. I moved to Vegas. I'm a poker player now, right? I got divorced in Vegas now. We're divorced. It's over. But our house and our cars are registered and titled in West Virginia. Where do we deal with that? Can we deal with that in Vegas? Why? Why would we do that? I don't know. I don't get that. I don't want to come back. I went to Vegas. Life's good out there. It's hot, but other than that, they got good air conditioning in the casinos.
If you don't come back, then she's gonna get all your stuff.
No, I want it separated. I want my stuff, my
You
stuff.
better come back and sign.
I do? Why? Why can't I just do it in Vegas court or in Nevada court? Skype in court? I'm just asking, where am I gonna go? What court's gonna decide it? Just because we think you should go to West Virginia, as a West Virginian, I think the West Virginia court should deal with West Virginia property, right? I feel that way. You all feel that way too? It's West Virginia property, it's West Virginia courts. Yes?
Yes.
I do. Why do we think that? Because it's the law, right? In rem jurisdiction. You remember that? In rem jurisdiction? That's why. Only the court where the property is located can have that. Okay, so the divorce is easy. You can do that anywhere. The marriage is domiciled. Where is anywhere the marriage is domiciled? Wherever one of the spouse is domiciled. That's confusing, right? Normally we don't come up with these issues very often, to be honest with you. But it has happened, and it makes it all confusing, and everybody argues, and then we have to decide what court to pick, what law we pick, because some laws benefit you better than others. That's called choice of law or conflict of law. It's a whole area of, I took a whole class on it. I don't remember anything about it. Other than the railroad goes between two states and you got to sue the railroad in the right state. That's all I know about that. Just telling you. So remember that. Sue them in the right state. It doesn't matter. There's federal law that makes the railroad win every time. Okay. So you understand that? Domicile? Then the next question is, where do we determine the issues of the child? Okay, where is the child domiciled? Well, it's domiciled wherever the court says the legal custody is. So a lot of court orders will say, and this comes in more to play after a divorce, but where does the court will a lot of times give split joint custody, and you both have legal custody. So now, what court do you go to? So I'll tell you cases like this. The kid is removed from the state of West Virginia to Marietta, and they file an action over there to protect the child. Which court has jurisdiction over the child? Ouch. That's confusing, right? Then you have a whole fight over that. Trust me, I've been in those. That's really complicated because neither court wants to do it nor give it away. It's the funniest thing. Oh, they need to decide that hard issue, but we'll decide the ones we want, right? That doesn't make it fun. Okay, got that? So all this all these concepts I talked about, that you get divorced, that's the easy part. Then the fight started, is what we know as divisible divorce. Okay, divisible divorce. That's what it's called. You dissolve the marriage, and then we deal with all the other stuff afterwards. Okay, so that's another way of referring to. You can get divorced. That's easy. I'm not going to go through in great detail the rest of these things, but what is the jurisdiction? We talked about that. Remember, I was telling you about in rem jurisdiction. It's wherever the marriage is, where the marriage is located. Okay, so where is the marriage located? All right, we remember that. But then we have to deal with where do we go to determine property distribution and all those things. You know about venue. That's the place basically that's most convenient. Okay, it's usually the county, that kind of thing. There's lots of pretrial stuff that you'd have to do. You file pleadings. It's just like a regular civil case in a lot of ways. Yeah, you can. It's not an automatic in family court, but
It's
yeah,
contested especially.
you have to actually seek discovery differently in family court cases, usually in family cases or in divorce cases. It's not like civil for that reason. Somewhat because you want to keep looking at that, but mainly because the parties aren't at arm's length. They do know each other's business a little bit more. So you already kind of know, so you don't need as much discovery. You can have the civil rules applied to you, a divorce case and all that kind of stuff. I mentioned that you're entitled to representation, but you're also like GALs are a lot of times appointed. That's a guardian ad litem. Who do they represent? The child or children. Okay. Usually they're a lawyer. They don't have to be. Not all states require them to be lawyers, but West Virginia basically does.
Would discovery at all come into place if the spouses were in totally different states? Could that
I would
be?
guess so.
That would be a case where you wouldn't necessarily have all the immediate information right at your fingertips.
You're entitled. Let me tell you this. Up front in a divorce case, you're entitled to all the financial information and all the property information. You're entitled to have all that. It's actually part of the required filings when you file a divorce petition is that you have to set forth your financials. It's called a financial disclosure. You have to give that. People a lot of times leave off things they don't want to put there because they're pro se. A lot of times pro se divorce seekers don't realize they have to be upfront honest. They would rather not tell the things they don't want to give up, but you're not really supposed to do that. I mean, we give you a pass to some level as long as we can figure it out. But no, lawyer can't do that. Lawyer has to go dig into your assets a little bit. Most divorces are done pro se without lawyers, right? Do you know that? The large bulk. That's just the way it goes. It's just, I mean, there aren't enough lawyers. There's not enough money to pay the lawyers a lot of times. So this makes sense. So generally we don't have we have bench trials. We don't have juries. I don't know in West Virginia we even have the option for a jury. We would probably refer any civil disputes actually back to circuit court in West Virginia. And this makes sense. It would be a kind of a tough place to put a family court judge. We pretty much force mediation. And then there's judgments, and then how do you collect on the judgments? We'll talk about all those particulars to the property and the money, but that's not really divorce. We lump those things together in what is a divorce proceeding, but really the hard parts are not the divorce. So I've reiterated that a lot of times today, but that's really the pretty easy part. Okay, you have any questions about any of those things? A lot of the rest of this is civil procedure oriented as opposed to divorce. I mean, it's not really particular to family law. So that's why I'm not really covering it in great detail, but it's generally just civil practice. It all has its little wrinkles. There's a different court you go to and things like that. It's a little less formal, partly because there are a lot of pro ses. It's also a little less formal because we have to make it simple. There are forms, pro ses, because there's a lot of people that are unrepresented. We try to make it, we've issued forms for a lot of things. So these court websites are really excellent for all the stuff all the paperwork you need. You can usually go down to the clerk's office, either in West Virginia or Ohio, and they'll give you a divorce packet. Okay, there's something else in Ohio that you can do that relates to uncontested divorces, okay, that you don't have in West Virginia. And they'll give you packets for that. All that's available on the internet too, with instructions about how to fill out all your forms and all that. Doesn't mean it's straightforward. It's like, all the tax forms you ever need to file are available on the IRS website, but does that mean you know how to fill them out? Not always, right? So keeping all those in mind. So any other areas, anything else you have questions about when it comes to this subject?
Do some states mandate arbitration or mediation as one of the go-to things for proceedings?
West Virginia basically, no such thing as really mandated mediation. However, if you cannot agree generally to parenting plan, there's like pretty much a mandated
So the court
mediation.
will order it then after that.
They'll order it, but what they do in West Virginia is refer it to a, what do they call it? They'll actually be evaluated for whether it's good for mediation, which you'll have to go and put it up. And that's really only if there's children. It's only for the parenting plan. The property distribution, you can take anything to mediation that you want. You know, it's all voluntary on that level. You're not going to see, I think in some states they talk about mandatory arbitrations. That would be in fairly complex cases you might with property.
Right, if you're assets, if you have a lot
If you have a lot of assets that you might have, that it makes more sense for you to have someone a little bit more learned about your property as opposed to a family judge be resolving those disputes, it might be better to have an agreed arbitration. But no court ever orders an arbitration. You have to agree to arbitration.
and it's binding or not
Binding. They would make it binding about particular issues probably. But ADR, I will say that the key most times if there's only one lawyer involved in a family court case for one side or the other, that person becomes de facto a mediator. That's a lot of times what that lawyer is doing, is mediating between the parties about what you need to resolve. Because a lot of the things about property distribution in particular is there's too much emotion involved in how you decide that, and the two people can't talk to each other at a rational level because for lots of reasons, good reasons, but the lawyer can kind of make that work a little easier. But they become de facto in that sense. That doesn't mean that it's not a full mediation. You're going to have that from time to time, but does that make sense? So you have a lot of ADR in divorce cases today. We try to put more of that in. A lot of times you get people to talk. It's good for them to hash out those things. Not always. It's not always good, but it can be. How do you? I put forth those are just the other ways you enforce a divorce decree or a divorce judgment.
That's a receivership.
Basically, it's where someone else holds the money and distributes it.
Almost like a trust.
Usually that would be a lawyer would be your receiver or a trustee. Another way of referring to it is a trustee. So you're going to put assets into a receivership. That person will manage them until it's determined how to distribute them. A lot of times the court may even order how it'll be, but you're going to have somebody manage it if it's a business or something like that. Okay, so any questions about divorce? I think that's one of the easiest subjects in family law is how you get a divorce. I just think it is. I don't know. I don't think it's actually the greatest thing that we have no fault divorce in some divorces. I mean, I think there ought to be some level of hashing it out, pointing some fingers, and it be in a public-ish forum. It's not totally a bad thing.
Do you think one of the greatest losers in a no-fault divorce could be the children? I mean, if you have parents that refuse to take responsibility for any actions, could that possibly go down with the children? I only know because I'm the product of such a thing.
Contentious issues.
My parents, one of them refused and absolved all responsibility of
Yeah.
anything. I'm just wondering.
That can be that's a good question. I don't know how that would resolve, but sometimes there is levels of fault and how it should play in. And I didn't tell what the code word was. What was it? Oh, the word for today is no fault. Safe word. It's not a safe word, Brenda.
No.
No fault is the safe word. Not the safe word, the keyword. Let's go with keyword or something. Safe word doesn't sound good. That sounds like another thing.
Fine.
Okay,
Still.
any questions? Okay, I'm gonna assign
Oh,
assignments that you'll just love,
Sure we will.
and that'll be due next week. And don't forget again, Legal Studies Society tomorrow at 3:30 and 13:30. 3, I'm sorry, not 3:30. 3
Yes, and
p.m.
as always.
Okay,
Fantastic.
thank you. I'm done.